Have you ever questioned whether anyone could see past your facade and love the real you? Chen wiped down the bar of the rusty anchor with a rag that had seen better days, his calloused hands moving in practiced circles. The expensive Rolex that usually adorned his wrist was locked away in a safe across town, replaced by a $20 digital watch from the pharmacy. His tailored suits hung untouched in a closet he rarely visited anymore, while tonight he wore a flannel shirt with a small tear near the pocket that he'd picked up from a second-hand shop. To anyone watching, he was just another bartender grinding through the late shift in a waterfront dive. Not the head of the most powerful shipping empire on the eastern seaboard. Not the man whose word could make or break fortunes. Across the scarred wooden bar sat a woman in pearls and a cashmere wrap, checking her phone every 30 seconds with the kind of exasperation that spoke volumes. Date number 7, courtesy of his sister who refused to believe he was fine being alone. Marcus already knew how this would end. It always did. He wasn't searching for someone who wanted access to his wealth or connections. He was searching for someone who could look at him and see a man, not a meal ticket. The woman finally stood, not bothering to hide her disgust as she glanced around the dim bar with its peeling paint and flickering neon signs. "This isn't going to work out," she announced, her tone clipped and final. "I need someone with drive, someone who wants more than pouring drinks in a place that smells like stale beer and broken dreams." Marcus felt the familiar wall go up around his heart, that protective barrier he'd built over years of disappointment. He nodded with practiced humility, his voice stripped of the authority it carried in boardrooms. "I get it," he said quietly. "I just thought this place had character." She didn't even wait for him to walk her out. Within seconds, she was gone, leaving him alone with the distant sound of waves hitting the dock outside. He stared at the watermarks on the bar, wondering if his search was futile, if the life he'd chosen to live made genuine connection impossible. The door creaked open, and a young woman entered carrying a stack of takeout menus, clearly making her rounds to local businesses. She wore jeans and a simple green jacket, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her name was stitched on her jacket in fatting letters, Sienna. As she approached the bar, she didn't judge the threadbare flannel or the cheap watch. Instead, she offered a smile that was equal parts exhaustion and genuine warmth. "Long night?" she asked, setting down a few menus as she noticed the second empty stool. "Looks like your friend couldn't handle the ambience." Marcus looked up, surprised by the kindness in her observation rather than criticism. "That transparent, huh?" he replied, finding himself returning her smile despite everything. Sienna laughed, a sound like rain on glass, clear and refreshing. "Well, she speed-walked past me outside like the building was on fire, and our Thai food is actually decent, so I'm guessing it wasn't the venue." She extended her hand. "I'm Sienna. I work at Bangkok Nights 2 blocks down." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar lightness. "Marcus, I think I could use some decent Thai food about now." Sienna's eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled, the overhead lights catching the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Best decision you'll make tonight. Don't let it bother you too much, you know. Some people are so obsessed with climbing ladders they forget to notice who's standing right next to them." She headed toward the door to continue her deliveries, and for the first time in months, the man who controlled shipping routes across 3 states felt truly seen, not for his empire, but for the lonely soul sitting behind a bar. He watched her pause to pet a stray cat outside and laugh at something the bouncer from the club next door said, her movements natural and unguarded. She was a restaurant worker in a worn jacket, and he was a king playing pauper. Yet somehow, the distance between their worlds felt more like a step than a chasm. 10 days later, Marcus found himself back at the rusty anchor on his night off, though he had no real reason to be there. He told himself he just liked the quiet, but his racing pulse told a different truth. He sat at the same bar in another thrift store, fined when Sienna walked in with more menus, her face brightening when she spotted him. "Back for punishment or just really committed to this place?" she teased, setting her stack down and leaning against the bar. Marcus felt warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the whiskey someone had ordered earlier. "Maybe I'm a glutton for both," he said, watching the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You look busy tonight." Sienna sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly in a moment of honest fatigue. Friday deliveries are brutal. My shift ends in about 45 minutes, though. Just trying to make enough tips to help my mom with her medical bills. Marcus felt guilt stab through him. He could pay off every hospital in the city without denting his accounts. Instead, he sat here pretending to struggle alongside her. "Tell me about your mom," he said, desperate to keep her talking, to understand what made her so resilient despite everything. Sienna's entire expression softened as she described her mother's battle with arthritis, the physical therapy sessions, the way she still insisted on cooking dinner even on her worst days. She spoke with such fierce love that Marcus felt envious. He'd built an empire that inspired fear and loyalty, but no one spoke of him with that kind of pure, selfless devotion. "You're a good daughter, Sienna," he said softly. She studied him with those perceptive eyes, and for a heartbeat, the noise of the bar faded completely. "And you're actually interested in listening, Marcus. That's rarer than you'd think. Hey, wait for me to finish up. There's a taco truck down by the waterfront that stays open late. My treat." The waterfront was freezing, the wind coming off the water sharp enough to sting. But as they walked along the pier eating tacos wrapped in foil, Marcus didn't feel the cold. Sienna wore that same green jacket, her hands wrapped around her food for warmth. They talked about everything: how the ocean looked different at night, the dreams they'd abandoned and the ones they still carried, the fears that kept them awake. Marcus found himself sharing things he'd never voiced before, carefully editing out the details of his business. He talked about the loneliness that came with expectations, the pressure of maintaining an image, the feeling of being invisible in plain sight. Sienna listened with an attention that made him feel anchored for the first time in years. "You know," she said, stopping near a lamppost overlooking the dark water, "my dad used to say that diamonds are just coal that handled pressure well. You seem like you've been carrying a lot of weight, Marcus." He looked at her, the lamplight catching in her eyes, and felt an overwhelming urge to confess everything, to tell her he wasn't a struggling bartender but a man who lived in a world of corporate warfare and calculated moves. But fear stopped him. Fear that the light in her eyes would turn to the same wariness he saw in everyone else when they knew the truth. "Just trying to figure out where I fit," he said instead, his voice heavy with everything he couldn't say. Sienna reached out and squeezed his hand, her fingers warm despite the cold. "Maybe you're already fitting in exactly where you need to be," she said softly. They stood there in the silence of the waterfront, two people from completely different realities, connected by something more honest than anything Marcus had built with money. When he finally walked her to her bus stop, he watched until the taillights disappeared, his heart carrying the weight of a secret and the terrifying realization that he was falling for a woman who didn't know his real name. As weeks melted into months, their connection grew into something that both thrilled and terrified Marcus. He started showing up at the Rusty Anchor whenever he could, sometimes just to catch a glimpse of her delivering menus. He learned she loved old mystery novels, that she was allergic to shellfish, and that she secretly dreamed of opening her own restaurant someday where people felt welcome regardless of their bank accounts. He wanted to hand her the world on a silver platter, but he was trapped in the character he'd created. One night, while they sat on the pier sharing coffee from a thermos after her shift, Sienna noticed a cut on his knuckles, a remnant from a tense negotiation with a rival company that had almost turned physical. "Marcus, what happened?" she asked, her voice shaking with concern as she carefully touched near the wound. He jerked back instinctively, a reflex from years of staying guarded, and saw the flash of pain in her expression. "It's nothing," he said quickly, trying to gentle his tone. "Just an accident at work. My boss, he's got a temper sometimes." Sienna's eyes filled with tears. "You shouldn't have to deal with people who hurt you just to pay your bills. You deserve so much better than someone who makes you bleed for a paycheck." Marcus felt his chest crack open, a physical response to the lie. She was crying for a fiction, defending a version of him that didn't exist. "I'm all right, Sienna. I promise," he said, taking her hands in his. They were rough from work, but to him they were precious beyond measure. He understood then that the moment of truth was approaching. He couldn't maintain this double life forever. He had to choose between the empire he'd spent his life building and the woman who'd reminded him what it felt like to be human. But as he looked at her, he realized his fear went deeper than rejection. He was terrified of the danger his world would bring crashing down on her. Corporate enemies didn't just attack balance sheets, they destroyed anything you cared about. He was a man standing on crumbling ground, and for the first time in his powerful life, Marcus Chen didn't have an exit strategy. The collision between Marcus's two existences came without warning in the most ordinary of moments. He was sitting at the Rusty Anchor on a quiet Tuesday, nursing a ginger ale while waiting for Sienna to swing by on her delivery route, when the door burst open with aggressive force. 3 men in expensive suits entered, men Marcus immediately recognized as executives from a rival shipping company he'd been quietly crushing in the market. They didn't notice him initially, tucked into his usual shadowed corner, but they began intimidating the owner about buying the property for development. Sienna walked in at exactly the wrong moment, immediately stepping between them and the elderly owner. "This place isn't for sale, and threatening people doesn't change that," she said firmly, despite the obvious tremor in her voice. The lead executive laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and reached for her arm. "Maybe you should mind your business, sweetheart." In a flash, the struggling bartender vanished. Marcus was across the room before anyone could breathe, his hand catching the executive's wrist in a grip that made the man gasp. The executive spun around ready to fight, but his face went chalk white when he recognized who held him. "Mr. Chen," he stammered, his knees actually buckling. The silence that followed could have shattered windows. Sienna looked from the terrified executive to Marcus, her eyes wide with confusion rapidly morphing into something darker. Marcus didn't release his grip. "Leave," he said quietly, with the kind of cold authority that had built empires. "This property is off limits. Do you understand me?" The men practically ran from the bar, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Marcus stood in the center of the room, the power he usually wore like armor now feeling like chains. He slowly turned to face Sienna, whose hand was pressed against her heart, her eyes searching his face like she was looking at a stranger. "What did he call you?" she whispered, her voice thin as paper. Marcus felt like he couldn't breathe. He reached toward her, but she stepped back, the movement cutting deeper than any wound he'd ever sustained. "Sienna, please let me explain," he began, but the words sounded pathetic even to his own ears. "You're not a bartender at all, are you? You're that Marcus Chen, the shipping magnate, the man who owns half the waterfront." She looked around the bar at the worn stools and faded pictures, then back at him, seeing the predator behind the disguise for the first time. "You're the person people warn each other about in business schools." Marcus felt his heart constricting painfully. "I did it because I needed to know if someone could love me for who I am, not what I own. I needed to know if someone like me could deserve someone like you." Sienna's face hardened, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You didn't let me make that choice. You took my trust and turned it into a costume you could wear whenever you wanted to feel normal. Please just go, Marcus. I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't think I want to figure it out." The following days passed in a haze of gray for Marcus. He returned to his penthouse overlooking the harbor, to his staff and his silk sheets and his floor-to-ceiling windows, but the luxury felt suffocating. He sat in his home office staring at shipping manifests, but all he could see was the green of Sienna's jacket, and the moment the light died in her eyes. He tried to return to his old life, to the acquisition meetings and strategic planning sessions, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. His board members noticed the change, the way their ruthless CEO seemed hollowed out from the inside. He realized that all the wealth he'd accumulated meant nothing if he couldn't share it with the one person who'd seen past it. He began making changes, quiet and radical. He started pulling back from aggressive business practices, establishing community funds, and ensuring the Rusty Anchor would never face development threats again. Not through intimidation, but through legitimate protection and investment. He stayed away from the bar, respecting her need for space, but he watched over her from afar, making sure she was safe. He made anonymous payments toward her mother's medical bills, ensuring the family he'd come to cherish had one less burden. But the emptiness inside him remained. He knew money couldn't purchase forgiveness, and power couldn't command a heart to trust again. He spent countless hours writing emails he never sent, trying to find language that could bridge the canyon his deception had created. One foggy evening nearly 6 weeks later, Marcus found himself outside the Rusty Anchor again. He wasn't wearing the flannel or his tailored suits. He wore a simple button-down and jeans, the middle ground of a man searching for his authentic self. He waited until the bar was nearly empty before entering. Sienna was wiping down tables, her back to him, but she stiffened when the door opened. She didn't turn around, but she knew. She'd memorized the sound of his footsteps over months of shared conversations. "I asked you to stay away," she said, her voice weary but lacking the sharp anger of their last encounter. "I know," he said, standing near the door, not approaching. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just wanted to give you this." He placed a folder on the nearest table. Inside was documentation of everything he'd changed since they last spoke. The charitable foundations, the restructured business practices, the proof that he was trying to become the person she'd believed he was. "I can't erase where I came from, Sienna, and I can't undo the lies, but I can choose where I go from here. I'm stepping back from the company. It'll take time, and it won't be simple. But I want to be someone who earns respect honestly. Even if you never speak to me again, I needed you to know that you changed me. You were the only authentic thing in my life, and I'm sorry I treated authenticity like a secret to keep." Sienna didn't open the folder. She studied him, her eyes examining his face for any trace of the corporate titan, but all she saw was a man who looked tired, humbled, and heartbroken. "It wasn't about the money or the power, Marcus," she said quietly, her voice breaking slightly. "It's that I felt safe with you, and discovering you were actually something I should have been afraid of. That's not easy to forgive." Marcus nodded, pain radiating through his chest. "I understand. I'll be at the pier tomorrow at sunset. I'll be there every evening until the first frost. If you can ever find it in yourself to talk to me as just Marcus, I'll be waiting. If you can't, I'll accept that too." He walked out into the fog, feeling more exposed than he ever had in any boardroom or negotiation. The next evening, he sat on a bench overlooking the water, the cold seeping into his bones, watching the sun paint the sky orange and pink. The pier grew dark and quiet, and he was about to stand and leave when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Sienna wrapped in her green jacket, holding 2 cups of coffee from the convenience store. She didn't smile, but she sat down beside him, handing him one of the cups. The coffee was cheap and slightly burnt, but as she hesitantly rested her head against his shoulder, Marcus felt like he'd finally found his way home. They had a long journey ahead, and the shadows of his past would never fully disappear. But for the first time, they were stepping forward together into honest light. Have you ever had to choose between who you were and who you want to become, or opened your heart to someone who broke it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about second chances and redemption.